And as we haven't met in a little bit, I do want to make sure everybody knows who everybody is. I will introduce myself first. Here I am. I'm Luke Sims. I'm the Assistant City Planner. I'm one of the co-leads for this project, and I'll hand it off to Carlos Espinoza. For those of you at the table, I do ask that you grab a microphone, hold it up close to your face, and speak into it whenever you do choose to speak.
Carlos Espinoza, City Planner.
Mike Hanson, Port Authority Commissioner. Brian Singer Towns, citizen, Airbnb owner.
Steve Young, City Council.
Andy Loos, local investor.
John Krofchak, Board of Adjustments.
Rick Jacks, Merchants Bank.
Tanya, you want to say hi?
Sure, I'm Tanya Johnson. I work for Winona Health.
And Nathan.
Yeah, hi, Nathan Woodworth with WKM Properties.
All right, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carlos to give us a rundown of what we're doing here today and what we are expecting to hear from all of you.
All right, at our last meeting, we did an overview of the future land use categories and talked about how the future land use categories on the map that's at our table here and also in that future land use section helps guide the future zoning of the city. And our assignment, or what we asked you to kind of take a look at or think about between last meeting and this meeting is, are there ways to make this more efficient? Are there categories that we can collapse, make more general? Because we've got a lot of them on this map here. I think we got upwards of 20, over 20 here. And so we'd be interested in finding ways to make it more efficient, make it easier to understand, and open up some more flexibility. So that's really what we're looking forward to discuss today. And I will hand it over to whoever would like to talk next.
Maybe this is too simple, but this is Nathan, and I used to play a lot of Sim City back on Nintendo days, and they had residential, commercial, and industrial. I understand we got some downtown core that's special, but what if we tried to focus on those three?
This is a good opportunity to talk about exactly what you're laying out there, which is the standard Euclidean zoning. So Euclidean zoning is the idea that we separate our commercial uses from our residential uses and from our industrial uses. And that really came out of an early 1900s court case in Ohio, the village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company. And I do want to note that one of the reasons why mixed use is shown so prominently here in particular is that there's been a lot of understanding since those mid 1900s to now that commercial and residential are really actually symbiotic relationships, and they do enhance each other. So having a neighborhood of residential units is augmented and improved by having a commercial corridor nearby. You can run out and do a quick grocery run, or you can run out and have a quick snack or a bar run or what have you. And really in 2007, what you're seeing on this future land use map is a recognition that the mixed use for a lot of our community is very important. And you'll note actually, if you take a look at some of these neighborhood commercial nodes throughout the city, and actually some that are missing. So if you look along like Hamilton Street, you'll note that there are bars there, for example. They're actually spaced about 0.3 miles from each other, which is really walkable, really easy to go get access to. I'm not saying that we don't need to move away from Euclidean zoning, but I do want to note that as the planning profession matures, there really is an emphasis on, in particular with the commercial and residential kind of cohabitating more versus industrial being a little bit more concerned with the negative externalities, the noxious fumes, the loudness, the different amounts of trucks and traffic that go in and out. So I do want to encourage you all to think about those things. But I agree with you, Nathan, SimCity, and taking a look at all of the different characteristics of just plopping things out on the map and seeing something immediately boom into a high commercial corridor is really valuable. And we can kind of think similarly as we look at this land use map.
I'll also say that I was reading some zoning things online, and actually one of them was a forum on Reddit, and people were chiming in from all over the world. And the biggest difference is exactly what you're saying from the rest of the world is what can people see in the United States is the fact that you cannot walk to get your groceries. You cannot walk to the local pub in so many communities in the US. So I think it would be pretty cool if we could, I think a lot of people will know can do that. And if we can encourage that more, that seems to be what the rest of the world has that the US is lacking, and that what people like.
I would agree. I spend a fair amount of my time working on some public health things, and I think particularly the west end of Winona has some opportunity for us to put or encourage some business growth there. There are neighborhoods that we probably could consider food deserts, especially in the west end of town, where there isn't anything within a mile of people. I think the first thing that strikes me is there's just so many categories that I feel like, could we just narrow it down to more of like, okay, this means industrial, this is neighborhood, this is, general purpose or general business use, and then just figure out where the best spots for those to go. Do we really need to have a mixed residential, an urban residential, all of these different things?
I think one of the things that we have in Winona right now is we've got industrial locations right across the street from residential, and they're not going away. Being on the Board of Adjustments, whenever something happens at a industrial institution, we have to clear it with the neighbors. But the buildings are already there. Solvay is in the neighborhood. We have manufacturing on 5th Street with the place that does down. There's all kinds of industrial places right in neighborhoods. And it's great if you live there, you can walk to work, but we're not going to change that. We just have to be aware of it and give some more flexibility on what we can do. So I think less zones would be really good, and a lot less of from 20 maybe down to 5 or 6.
Mike Hanson, I would agree. I've been really intrigued since the last meeting about, for instance, in my neighborhood, we're not going to bring back Liefeld's grocery. I mean, the mom and pop groceries aren't coming back, but what about, nail salons and, Brown's picture framing is about 2 blocks away, things like that can get mixed in. I agree on the food deserts. I mean, even in my neighborhood, you got to get in your car to go get some groceries. So.
There are quick trips though, just about everywhere, and they're not that far away from most people.
But it's high price groceries.
They're high price everywhere now, Mike. Can we talk about some specific things? We were talking about this before the meetings, and I'm on the Board of Adjustments, and so right now we're going to be having Winona State University, which is one of the economic drivers of this community, critical to this community. And they're having to request a variance really on their own campus for housing. And so my suggestion is that we expand that, and then the area around that basically supports the campus with the zoning that we have right now of R2 and R1 isn't really cutting it. We need to have more students in that area closer to campus. And somebody brought up, maybe we should make like R3 around a couple of blocks around the campus. And I think that's something we really need to look at. That's where the students need to be. It needs to be close to the campus so they can walk and get some higher densities and move on with life.
So to elaborate on that, John, if you could, so we were just talking about narrowing the number of land use categories here for this future land use map. And one of the comments was briefly, do we need urban residential? Do we need traditional neighborhood? Are you suggesting that we just have a residential zone and that our residential designation and then use the more nuanced components in the zoning elements?
Yes, absolutely. Just get it down to 2 or well, maybe 3 or 4, but you've got an industrial, you have commercial, and you have residential, and then you have public spaces. So you can have your parks and stuff. You're not going to be building on there. You've got schools, but still, it gets pretty restrictive with all these different things, and the rules are hard to understand. I mean, what's the difference between low density residential and traditional neighborhood? I mean, Do you know what they are? I know you do, but I mean.
Yep. Yeah, and I do think that there is value in having different tiers, classifications of residential, just being able to define, what type of character you want a specific area to be guided towards. Are we looking at this area as having, for instance, more density, this area is having a little bit less density, just to be able to fit the character of the area and areas that might be transitioning. I think that there's definitely opportunity to combine, for instance, the mixed residential and urban residential. I think the differences between those two categories are pretty minimal. And the urban residential is also, I think, kind of a misnomer, because we'd like to see some higher density style uses as part of a overall subdivision in the future, similar to what you have in Knott Valley. And to try and reclassify land to that's south of 61 to urban residential, it just sounds like, what are you doing? The urban area is here. So being able to collapse those two, I definitely think that there's room to be able to do that, definitely. But then I do think that there is value in having a difference between some of the more higher density residential areas, when you think of maybe apartment areas or attached townhomes, traditional neighborhood where you have a lot of maybe that missing middle, and multiple units. And then the lower density where you have predominantly single family or the potential for duplexes in those areas.
So Carl, what's the difference between limited residential, low density residential, traditional neighborhoods?
Yeah. And so I think that there's also the ability to combine limited and low density residential. So right there you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories. I think you could pretty easily get that down to 3: low, medium, and high density.
So where is recreational riverfront? Is that the East End Boat Harbor and?
In Levy Park.
Well, no, Levy Park isn't. Levy Park is public and open space. Yeah, I mean, you've got. I mean, it's the East End Boat Harbor. I mean.
Carlos, could I ask if we consolidate some of those residential ones, is there some flexibility or some things that you lose? What's the downside to this? I mean, I think we all see there's an upside to doing this, but I want to be careful. Are there unintended consequences to losing? Could someone come in and take advantage and we have a result we don't want?
Definitely. So that's why, after we kind of have this general conversation of things that could be combined, getting a little bit deeper and taking a look at the two, I think that at the next meeting is where we can take a look at, all right, so you have these two classifications. If you combine them, what are some considerations that we should have so that we try to minimize those unintended consequences into the future?
Yeah, and then just building on that, my first thought when looking at this was the same thing. Let's get this down to 7 or 8 or 9 categories. It's just overwhelming. I'm thinking, but I'm guessing that the reason there were so many categories was to make sure there was a good transitions between different types of land use, so you don't end up with a big commercial new development ending up right beside a traditional neighborhood. I mean, I'd be pissed off if that happened, so I guess my question is, how do we keep that idea of there being a reasonable and good transition between the different types of land use and not lose that as we combine categories? I don't know that's rocket science, but just that'd be one of my concerns about what might we lose if we went down to just 3 categories. Holy crap, I mean, somebody could be building a new Fastenal building right beside, my home. Maybe, I don't know. I'd be worried about that.
And I think part of, approach to that too, is if you reduce the number of categories, what you want to make sure that you're doing is that you have an appropriate transition category between between two disparate categories or two categories that might be significantly different. So for instance, and I always look at this, looking at WSU, it's designated as semi-public institutional education, and then right across the street, you have traditional neighborhood. Well, the character of the area for at least 2 blocks on the east or west sides of WSU is not necessarily that traditional neighborhood that's the same as the rest of the core of Winona. It's more of a student, higher density type character in that area. So to get at what you're saying, Brian, what I think you do is you use the different categories that we have to soften the transitions between one land use and another land use, especially where they're dramatically different.
And this might be a good time to also talk about, well, we're talking about the land use map right now and the land use categories. They provide the foundation for the additional regulations found in the Unified Development Code and the zoning map. And when I hear what you just brought up, Brian, what I immediately think too is a concept called dynamic zoning. So the idea is if we redesignated, say, our residential districts to all be traditional neighborhood, and then an entire block became duplexes, for example, they would then be able to go up to that next level of density. They'd immediately hit a threshold, basically, that within our zoning code, even though it's still traditional neighborhood, you could now put in 4plexes, for example, or you could jump up to that next tier. Those concepts exist. And then similarly, one thing that we introduced in 2017 are form-based codes. So say somebody did want to put in a commercial building, maybe we allow that in traditional neighborhood designated areas on corner lots first. And then if your corner lot converts into a bar, the neighboring place can go ahead and become a laundromat, so on and so forth. But the form-based code elements would make sure that it's consistent and still within the neighborhood character, kind of similar to Mike was talking. We're not gonna have those grocery stores come back, but maybe we're going to have a flower shop or something similar up here. So there are nuances within the zoning code that this would be able to support. Yeah.
So with the 2-block corridor on each side, would we be talking about lifting the 30% rule to something like 60? And then what happens to the people who are already grandfathered in outside that corridor? Does that eventually just, it's not grandfathered in? When they decide not to continue as a rental unit, it can't be a rental unit?
So what would happen is if we were to rezone the area surrounding WSU on east and west sides, or even just the areas where you have an overwhelming percentage of the block as rental, what we could do is rezone it to R3. So the 30% rule does not apply in the R3 zoning district. So in the areas that would be rezoned to R3, the 30% rule would not apply any longer. So those 1 or 2 properties that are left on the block that are owner occupied could go to rental. But under our current code right now, the maximum number of renters you can have per unit is 3. That has come down from 5, then it was at 4, now it's at 3 per unit. So right there, you're having a new unit come online, but most likely it's not going to be a super, inordinate amount of increase in density. So you're gonna have a property or 2 probably convert to rental in that 2-block area. But right where it starts to transition to kind of more of a mix between student housing or rental and non-rental, that would still stay the R2 zoning. So you'd still be able to have your rental as long as you keep it up and keep that certificate going. Nothing would change for you. It would just allow some flexibility in the areas surrounding WSU so that if you wanted to sell your house, you'd have more options.
So if the certificate is not kept up, could someone else come in and recertify?
Block is already over. So the way it works with the 30% rule is if you are already over 30% on the block, so 30% of the properties on a block are already rental, you're grandfathered in if you're at like 50% or 60% for that block. But if you have a property on one of those blocks where it applies, you have to continue to keep your certificate up. and pay for the renewals. And we're nice. We send you 2-3 letters and, even a nice phone call before we would, pull the license or anything like that. So mostly what people do is they see the value in that. So even if they're looking to sell their property, they'll renew the license. The license will still be valid. It goes with the property, not with the owner. And so when they market their property, they can say, hey, there's options here for the property and you can continue to rent it if you so choose.
So I look at the two schools we had, Central and Madison, and they're both now semi-public institution education zoning. And I'm assuming now they probably should be R3 at a minimum.
So
And how do we change that easier than?
yeah, so this land use map is reflective of the 2007 future land use maps. This map has gone through some changes since then. Madison School, which is over here, and Central School, which is over here, are good examples. Madison School went through and did get that urban residential designation, which then led to a rezoning of R3. So it became only residential allowed in that zoning district. Central School went through a rezoning a land use map change to neighborhood commercial and then was rezoned to mixed use neighborhoods. So they would allow those commercial amenities that are fit within a neighborhood to occur on that block. So these maps do change every so often. We have that process built into our city code, but this map is not currently reflecting those changes. One of the things that we do want to have from the comp plan is the ability to dynamically change these maps as they do grow and adapt over time, so that we're not stuck looking at one static PDF from 2007, 10 years down the road.
I'll just open it up to those who are joining us on Zoom. We've had some conversation around the table here. Any thoughts from you, Nathan or Tanya? And that's just fine if not. One thing I'd like to transition to taking a look at is the Nathan or Tanya, would you guys like to say anything at this point? Nope, I think we're good. Okay, so one thing I'd like to do is transition to the next map actually, which is the urban expansion area. And at our last meeting, we talked a little bit about how each one of these categories that you see here is kind of like a blob, essentially. I don't have a better term for it, but a blob of a specific use pattern. And one thing that we wanted to explore is categories, or I'm sorry, corridors extending south from the city, where you could have a greater mix of different uses instead of just these specific use areas. So for instance, along County Road 44 or Garvin Heights Road, perhaps that would be somewhat of a mixed residential and limited industrial classification. That's where our utilities are already at the top of the bluff. And could you extend those utilities to the south and promote not just some type of residential development, but also limited industrial or limited manufacturing types of uses that occur all within a building, don't have any outside storage, and don't impact uses that are next door. Taking a look at that, we think would be something that's valuable. In addition, applying the same type of classification to Highway 43 as you go south out of the city of Winona. It's a little bit different situation there, where you have a significant distance before you get up onto the top of the bluffs and you have more developable area. And then finally, the corridor along County Road 17 out in the Pleasant Valley area, looking at that as potentially more of a residential style corridor, but instead of it all being designated low density, which is what it currently is, allowing for a greater mix of residential uses in that area.
Carlos, unless you have some high density, you're never going to have anybody build up there, because the cost of the land, number one, but then to go ahead and develop it is astronomical. I mean, you cannot have 2 lots per developable acre. That's just not going to work. You're going to have small lots like we have in the city of Winona. And I mean small lots, 50 or 60 feet wide. I mean, the vast majority of people can get by with 1,000 square feet. We did it in the 50s and the 60s. There's no reason why we can't do it now. You don't have to have a 2,400 square foot house as a starter home. We could have smaller houses or maybe row houses. We've got to use the limited resources we have, and we have to do that with density. We cannot do it spreading out. I mean, we have a development that's not going to happen because it's just too expensive. No, I'm talking on 44. Yeah, up and down. I mean, we had a development and it still shows it's inside the city limits, but city gave it back to the township, I think, which was a backward step, but nevertheless, there's 44 acres that are now going to be, has one house on it. I mean, that's not the way to get people up on top of the hill. We're going to have to, we cannot have rural residential in those areas. If we're going to have anything happen, you've got to have some density. We need a quick trip so people can walk to it and get gas, drive down the hill.
As long as you can make it to where the hill starts to go down.
Exactly. But no, if you want to have more, you know, we talk about industry. If you were a new industry and wanted to move to Winona, there's no land to build. I mean, a little bit in the park, but there's no large tract of land. And to start buying individual houses and then tear them all down, that's not going to work. So you're going to repurpose buildings, perhaps. You know, the Featherlight one on 5th Street, that's a great repurpose. I'm glad that they're there. They're taking a building that was empty and they're using it. They're not expanding it, but they're using it.
You mean the Enlightened equipment?
Enlightened, yes, yeah. I mean, you know, if you're looking to do a business, in order to build a new building, there just isn't any place to build a new building. You have to repurpose something that's already here, and hopefully it's big enough. And it may be in an area that is residential, but the building is still there. So let's repurpose it and use it.
There are opportunities at the top of the hill off of 90, the Wadle land. And there are opportunities there. I mean, granted, you don't have water, but you can put a well in, you can put a high pressure fire suppression system in. It's right off the highway. I mean, encouraging that development, I think, would be in Winona's best interest. And I'm sure that Wade would be happy to make a trade.
Well, they are doing a big, it's a gasification plant is going in there. Actually, they're putting it way in the back and they're putting in a road and it's gonna, so that is going ahead. I talk to companies every day and I've talked to a couple different companies over the last 10 years that are looking for space in Winona. And I've always mentioned the Wadle land. And at this time, for a lot of the people that want to hire people to work, they don't want to be there because they know that their employees aren't going to want to drive that far and like you said, be that far away from the nearest quick trip or the nearest place to go for lunch. They'd rather find something that's a little more traditional, but the Wadle land I do think is going forward and will add some benefit to what we're talking about.
And you're saying, Nathan, that is happening without, that's under township zoning, no utilities, but they're making the improvements they need for their facility without having city utilities up there.
I guess if you're not in the loop and haven't talked to them, then that's what they're doing. But yeah, it's moving forward.
Thanks.
So, some of what I just heard from this recent exchange here is a little bit of the need to kind of encourage that traditional Winona development pattern if we do expand is really what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that there's a mix of industrial, a mix of this traditional residential neighborhood with commercial elements sprinkled in, and particularly if large employers only want to locate where they can have places to eat for their employees, particularly if they can only locate where they have employees who are going to be willing to get to those locations. I do want to raise some attention to how does that reconcile, I want to ask this question, how does that reconcile with the fact that we do still have agricultural districts and agricultural areas in some of these expansion areas as well? I do want to raise a point that Winona County in particular has prime soils designations, and you all are probably aware that southeastern Minnesota has some of the richest soil in the world. How does this group feel about moving forward? Based on what John was saying, for example, sounds like using the land to its highest and best use in terms of smaller lots, more residential, as well as that industrial infill and commercial infill seems like a good trade in terms of using that potentially agricultural land. Any thoughts?
Having done some development, I can tell you that there's not that much available land. And it's always been my contention, if a farmer plows the field, you can build a house on it. Okay, but we have some rules in the city of Winona where you can't do that. It's too steep. I think that has to be looked at too. And we should be using steep land to build houses on rather than flat, good agricultural land. Good agricultural land should remain agricultural. I like to eat too. So we should be saving that land. What we're telling everybody now is, oh, use the flat land to build houses and don't build on the slopes. We can mitigate slopes. We should be building on the slopes and not building on the flat, in my opinion.
You know, what John says really resonates with me. I'm from Menominee, Wisconsin, grew up farming. And there's you know, a tract of land that we had rented at one point. It's all, you know, it's small business. And I remember my dad saying, he says, they always develop on the best land, the flattest land, the pieces that we used to farm. And it's all light industrial now, out by the hospital on the east side of Menominee. And so John, that really resonates with me. If we can have more flexibility, so we can develop some of that edge land that isn't that prime farmland. Soil is a finite resource. Soil is a finite resource. Yeah, that's important. Healthy soil.
I'm all for saving the bluffs, and I don't think, you know, the top of Garvin Heights should be developed in a bunch of houses and things set up there. But if you look at like Valley Oaks and Knob Valley and Wee Valley and some of these that are iconic Winona developments and awesome neighborhoods, great places to grow up and for a family, etc. A lot of those couldn't be done today, at least not in the same way, and they probably wouldn't have been viable to do because of the restrictions. So I know this probably hasn't been challenged yet, but if a developer wanted to come in and do one of the little coulees around Winona and said, hey, I want to build these houses up, not up to the top, but as high as they used to put them in these existing subdivisions, I think that would probably be something we would probably look pretty hard at, I guess.
I always look at the pictures of Europe where people want to go on vacation, like in Greece and stuff, and you got all these houses up the side of hills that, my God, you get so much exercise just walking home at night. I mean, it works other places as long as we have engineers that are smart that can mitigate these things and building on the side of hills. I know people don't like to see them, but you know, we as Winona, as a city, shouldn't be on a sandbar, but we are. I mean, we're in the middle of the river. Probably shouldn't be here.
And, you know, I do see a difference too when it comes to visibility and erosion and, you know, kind of what the bluffs look like from the main Mississippi River Valley area. You know, it really, when you take a look at the bluffs and the bluffs surrounding Winona, what really gives it its character related to the bluffs, or what the bluffs look like from the core area of Winona. When you go south of 61 and you get kind of into some of these back valleys or some of the back coulees, as they call them over in Wisconsin, you know, perhaps that, you know, view shed isn't as important in those areas. I'd be inclined to think it's more important to preserve that green view shed in the Mississippi River Valley area. But once you go a little bit further to the south at some of these potentially developable areas, that maybe that is still important, but the regulations may not have to be as onerous as they are right now. And one thing too, any other comments on the kind of like the urban expansion area and taking a look at expansion to the south of the city?
I just have one thing to add. I think, have we, I mean, I think this is all really great conversation. I think that, you know, potentially looking to add more homes up on the top of the hill up by Garvin Heights, there could be some consideration as to whether or not, especially right now, people are interested in one building, two traveling that far for work and groceries and things like that, just like we've kind of all mentioned. And then if we're really thinking that the population of Winona is not going to increase, is it even really necessary for us to be looking at building more homes? I mean, I can see perhaps apartment complexes to create affordable housing for people who aren't able to own a home. I could see us looking at, I mean, we've all said that the education areas are declining in enrollment, right? The colleges are. So is there a reason for us to not be looking at what already exists with all those things taken into consideration instead of debating on whether or not we should be developing bluffs or, you know, what have you?
Definitely, Tanya. And so, you know, I think that comes into a little bit of what the housing subcommittee is talking about. And so what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years here in the city of Winona is really a significant decline in the amount of new single family homes that are being developed. Not that we don't want to have land where you can do that into the future, because that's an important component of our land use and an important component of our city. But what we have seen is an increase in the number of multifamily units that we've permitted. And it's not just apartment complexes, it's twin homes, for instance, in Valley Oaks. It's a greater diversity of different styles of housing that isn't your traditional single family home on a large lot. And so moving forward, granted, we're not going to see a significant population increase. We see a lot of that growth in terms of housing coming from an increase in the core area of the city of Winona. So transitioning existing homes from single family to duplexes, for instance, or triplexes and that type of thing before you have wholesale expansion out further, just given our projections in terms of population into the future, and also the costs of development and constructing a single family home are significantly more now than they were 20 years ago or 30 years ago when we saw a lot of the expansion to the south of the 61 corridor.
I would only say this, Tanya, and that is the population of the city, it's a double-edged sword. There are a lot of people that drive in from other areas to come to work at Winona that can't find a place here in town. So they have to commute from wherever it is, Arcadia or wherever. And I don't know how many people are doing that, but it's a significant number of people. So if I'm worried about paying high gas prices, would I rather live in Arcadia and commute to Winona or live in Winona? I would rather live in Winona. You know, we've had some developments. We've had a couple of schools with probably 30 apartments. They're all rented as far as I know. I mean, there's not that many vacancies out there in the rental market. And I think if we had more, we'd rent them, because I'm not going to want to pay gas anymore at $5 or $6 or $10 a gallon to drive very far. I want to be as close to work as I possibly can be. And a lot of people, I could say, commute to this city from other areas.
No, I agree with that. I think my biggest point was just is single family home development where we should be focused on. We know that the population is aging in Winona, right? We know as a healthcare organization, we know that soon we're going to have a whole generation of people who are going to need care, or very least aren't going to want to take care of their single family homes anymore. So my question is more along the lines of, should we be focusing more on, just like what was said, twin homes, complexes where maybe there is no yard work or things like that needed, that kind of stuff, over the development of single family homes. I agree with you. I do live just outside of Winona. It takes me it's about an 8-mile drive for me. And while I'm okay with that, I don't think everybody is okay with that. And so if I did live in a different city and I had to drive to Winona, I might not be happy with that. But I also understand that single family home ownership is declining exponentially. It is very difficult for students who are graduating right now or people who are newly married to even be able to purchase a home on their own. So rental property, however we look at it, whether it's duplexes, whether it's complexes, whatever it is, I think might be our better bet.
I would agree with that. I mean, you know, developers are people too. They understand if they can't develop single family lots, they'll develop multiple residential lots, and that's based upon the market. So people aren't going to do things where they can't make some money on it. So if we can have all the R1 we want to, but if it costs too much money to build it, it's not going to happen. Probably the banks won't give them money either.
All right, thanks, everybody. What I'd like to do now, I think we have about 20 minutes left, is transition and talk a little bit more about commercial and industrial areas, because those are two of the other classifications that we have on the map that you see here. And so in terms of commercial, it's really the red colors. So we have the darker red, which is the general commercial. Then we have the neighborhood commercial, which is the lighter red. And then in terms of industrial, we have the darker purple and kind of the lighter purple, as well as this general mixed use category. So I definitely see the ability to collapse some of those categories. But really, if you pull back and kind of think about what we've been discussing thus far, it's how do we best utilize the land that's closest to the people that are working in the places where there is industrial jobs available. And so to the extent that we can offer some more flexibility within these designations to allow that development to happen in these areas, I think would be an important thing based on the conversation that we've been having thus far in the meeting. And I just open it up for comments related to the commercial and industrial designations in the future land use plan.
I'd have a question. Because of the multiple land use designations that we have, what hasn't happened? What hasn't happened in the past 30 years? Now you're talking in the context of commercial and industrial, but what are we missing? What do we hope would happen if we collapse some of these? Is it just ease for companies entering, or what did we miss? Let's start with that.
I'll speak to my personal observations on that. And I don't know that it's actually going to point more directly to industrial or commercial growth, but I think that what we've actually missed is residential flexibility in those land use designations. We have not seen, unlike a lot of other cities, conversion of former industrial properties into residential properties. We have not seen as much residential growth in what is currently our general commercial designation, which does allow for some residential and within those zoning categories that a lot of other communities are seeing and leaning into that mixed use component. I think that there probably is room to create a transition or emerging closer to those, particularly limited industrial classifications that are not going to have those. They're going to have more of those negative components internal to the operation rather than external. But we're also, there's some residual hanging on there. But as was noted in some of the conversation earlier, there really isn't a lot of available industrial land either. So there's kind of a question of, is it worth preserving with a more restrictive land use category so that an industrial use could be located there in the future? Or is it better to see that transition and the ability to see that flexibility? And that's just a personal observation. I don't have a specific number related to that. But we're seeing a lot more other communities particularly see that residential sprinkled in more regularly.
I just have a question, being really ignorant of this. What have we seen more growth in since the last plan, commercial or industrial? And what do we foresee more growth in, commercial or industrial?
That's a good question. I think one thing for sure that we need to have into the future is available land for commercial and industrial or manufacturing use to maintain that reservoir to a certain extent of available land that could be put to a use like that. So when somebody comes into our community development department and talks to Lucy or talks to Nick and, hey, I want to, either build my new business or expand my business, what's some land that's available? They have land that's at their disposal that they can point people towards. That's, in my mind, the most important thing. But then for some of the pieces of land that currently exist and they're way too small to be utilized for modern industrial purposes, can we transition those to some type of residential development? So being able to utilize some of the industrial areas that are currently kind of on the fringes of the existing industrial in the core area of Winona to allow residential in those areas, I think would be one way to add in some additional capacity for residential growth. But then on the other hand, when you're taking a look at new industrial land, making a focus on the areas where it meets the needs of modern industries.
And just to add to that, I did pull up our top employers from 2021 and 2011. So you can kind of look at what's changed over the last 10 years here. This was recently released earlier this week, and we were just using it for our economic development subcommittee yesterday. And one of the takeaways I have here is, one, there isn't really a lot of change in our total top employers. But also it's important to note that even our top employers don't make up 85% of our total employment base. We have a very diverse base. And one of the things that the Economic Development Subcommittee really wants to focus on is, who are the entrepreneurs that we can encourage to open new businesses? Who's that next wave of entrepreneurs? Who's going to begin that new smaller business? Is there space for them to begin that new smaller business and grow into these larger industrial footprints or into these larger commercial footprints? And I think that this is actually a really good thing to point out, because it shows that we have a lot of employers that aren't particularly massive. A lot of our employment base is for employers that are not at 300 employees or more. So there is room, especially in that area, to grow into either some of these larger footprint areas, or maybe they're content in their smaller footprints, but there's probably a need for a mixture, is what I'm getting at.
Fastenal just bought the Badger complex. RTP has bought a lot of land on the east end and have built, I don't know who's not aware of it, but I mean, they've built some huge facilities on the east end. RTP has in the last year and a half, and they're continuing to build. So I'm thinking the big guys kind of taking care of themselves. It's the people below that are just starting that are going to need the help. And I think between the Port Authority and you guys have done some great work putting parcels together, and I think you're probably going to have to do more in order to facilitate. Yeah. And you're doing a good job based upon how much land there is available. What about, we talked about this before the meeting. I don't want to make everybody in the community upset, but the only big parcel of undeveloped land is Westfield Golf Course. And years ago, when we were talking about building an incinerator, I don't know if you guys remember that or not, but everybody was wild over that. But I always thought, all that land, they should put the golf course out there. Could have made an 18-hole golf course, public golf course, and use Westfield for development. Where they were going to put the incinerator out on Highway 43. And now we have, 3 golf courses in town, and none of them are actually none of them are busy enough to really justify their own existence. I mean, do we need to have 3 golf courses? We have 2 private golf courses that are wonderful courses. Do we need to have a 3rd public one? Or should the city buy one of those and make it public?
And golf courses are something too that, really, it's a trend nationally. The traditional municipality golf courses just aren't they're not making it as much anymore. So that has been one thing that has come up. You know, some of the more private, premier courses are doing great, but the city courses, for instance, are having a rough go of it. And a lot of cities throughout the nation and in Minnesota have had success in introducing some type of development into golf course areas, maybe shrinking it from 18 holes down to 9 holes, or maybe doing some type of redevelopment in the golf course area, because a lot of times the golf course area or golf courses are pretty close right into where the city is. And the land is actually pretty valuable. And, you just think of how big Westfield is, or, how big the golf courses are, and how much land is there, and how much land could be used for housing, mixed residential and park area that isn't just dedicated to golf, that could be used by a greater swath of people. Not that, it's a public course right now. You can go to Westfield if you want to, but you feel pretty out of place if you're not swinging a golf club on the course right now and being out there. So.
Can you mitigate Westfield?
I think the overall message would be that there's a lot of land in that area. What would there be for potential uses for it in the future? It's the discussion is too that it would slash land to a certain extent, but how does that gift apply now, and is there flexibility in how that land was dedicated based on when it was dedicated and some of the provisions therein? Can we provide that public component and that public accessibility to the land, while at the same time in the future, if the golf course can't feasibly operate any longer, have some different style of development in that area? So can we still maintain the public feel of it in terms of maybe, for instance, having a public park there, but right next to that public park, having some new residential development, for instance? Exploring that, I think, would be a valuable thing to take a look at, especially when you see how much land there is in that location, right in the core area of the city. I'm glad Caesar from the Winona Post is not here right now.
A similar size piece of land is St. Mike's Field. I believe that's on a 99-year lease, though.
Oh, can you hear me? One of the thing about the golf course though, is it is in the community, it's in town, which provides access to a lot of the youth golfers. And that would be something terrible to take away, in my opinion. No, I don't disagree. And if you're looking at everything space around Lake Winona or what have you, that's all there too. So, and that's a Frisbee golf course. Take away the Frisbee golf course.
I agree. I don't think our answer is taking away green space in Winona. And I know the proposal is not to eliminate it completely, but even I think partially would be terrible for the city.
I agree. The amount of pushback there, it would not happen.
Yet I'm glad we discussed it. We've got to be able to talk about even things like that. So. there are trade-offs, and I see this in, you know, other areas I'm involved in, that there aren't answers that are gonna please everyone. And there are downsides to some of these decisions, but we're all working towards the greater whole. So I hope we can have more discussions over sacred cows like golf courses. And I'm not proposing something either way, but we've got to be able to get this stuff on the table.
Sacred cows are historical districts. You know, high density population brings in business. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. So, you know, you focus on the core downtown, you know, allow some taller buildings to replace some of those older dilapidated buildings, that type of thing. It's kind of some thoughts I've had as I walk around downtown and I'm looking, yeah, it's a historic building, but why? You know, some of them anyway.
Right, and being able to go a little higher, I mean, is it 84 feet? I mean, if
75 feet.
Fastenal would have had a completely different footprint if they could have gone taller. I know this.
For the one they built.
For the office building downtown.
So how much taller would they like to have gone?
I believe they were talking 1 or 2 stories.
They should have asked. You know, we were talking about this before the meeting. Valley View Towers. I mean, it's way over 75 feet tall. You know, the one dorm was way over. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with another tall dorm like that. I mean, they're students. You want to have a lot of students in a small space. What would be wrong with that? I think we need to be more flexible on the height. I really do. I think, you know, why 75 feet was picked, I don't know. I mean, was this an arbitrary number?
Probably had something to do with fire code.
Shouldn't be fire code.
To do with the
Water a long ways up.
airport zoning.
It wouldn't, not in the downtown area, no. To my knowledge, that's the maximum height that's been in the code since it was originally written in 1955, 1960. So what we did is we actually allowed more areas in the downtown to go up to 75 foot with our new zoning code that we just did a few years ago. So we expanded and gave more flexibility in height to a lot of areas in the downtown that you could only build up to 40 feet for all the way up until 2017. So are there additional areas, you know, particularly in the fringe of the downtown area where we could look again at increasing that height limit? And what the zoning code does is it provides for gradation of heights, you know, so if you're putting a 75-foot building in, the next height limit would be 40 foot, and then it goes down to 35 foot in the residential zoning district, so that you don't have what Brian has kind of referred to a little bit, you know, huge big building right next to you, that there's at least a gradient and a stepping down in terms of required heights.
Valley View though is right next to residential, then it's 150 feet tall, and we've got 1-story buildings right next to it. Houses, R1 houses. So I mean, it's not unprecedented. We've done it before.
Definitely. And so, you know, what our code tries to do is create a kind of a general pattern that we'd like to see. But if there's a specific instance where, you know, higher density and a little bit taller is warranted, then that's a perfect case for a variance, as long as they make a good case for it.
I do want to note we're having some really good discussion, but we do have to plan our next meeting. So if everybody could take a look at their calendars here, we would be looking at potentially meeting here at the end of June, perhaps maybe the 23rd, which would be 2 weeks out. These Thursday mornings at 8:30 seem to be working well for people. We got one yes. I see a lot of, yep, great. More head nods, head nods. Anybody have an issue with 8:30 in the morning on the 23rd? All right, Seeing none, we'll go ahead and pencil that in. I do want to note also on the 21st at 6:30 PM, we will be having Chuck Marone of Strongtown speaking to the public. He is going to be speaking from the Friendship Center. So I will send out a calendar invite for all that to you. And we do encourage you to attend that if you can.
And again, I just want to thank everybody for the discussion today. As Councilmember Young noted, it's important for us to be able to talk about even some of the most thorny land use issues and land use considerations. So appreciate it, everybody. We'll see you in another 2 weeks.
Thank you.